So a warm welcome to everybody at the HEAS seminars. And although we are currently enjoying university holidays, I'm happy to see so many people here. So a warm welcome to the physical audience as well as to the digital audience online. And we're quite happy to welcome Lasse Sörensen as our speaker today. Well, Lasse is quite well known, I would say, in the stone community and especially in the Neolithic community, not only in Europe, also in Southwest Asia and the Aegean. Lasse did his undergraduate studies in Copenhagen University, where he finished his bachelor first. Then he went to Tübingen University in Germany, where he did his master's, and went back to Denmark, where he did his PhD thesis on the topic From Hunter to Farmer in Northern Europe, Migration and Adaptation during the Neolithic and Bronze Age. And from there onwards, well, he was quite active and engaged in many projects. And in one of these first projects, we met about 10 years ago for the first time. He is now head of the Department for Ancient Cultures of Denmark and the Mediterranean, and he is a senior researcher in the National Museum of Denmark in Copenhagen. So everybody familiar with prehistory knows that there is one of the hugest collections of important stone artifacts in the world, I would say. And he's an expert on these stone tools, not only, but also he published a lot of things, also in quite high impact journals like PLOS ONE, Antiquity, Journal of Archaeological Science, etc. So I don't have to mention all these in details. Well, we are happy to have you here. And yeah, maybe I should also mention that he was awarded with an ERC grant quite recently, and we are quite happy to collaborate in this grant with you. So congratulations to this grant again. And we're happy to hear a talk on From Stone to Home, Exploring Polished Stone Tool Biographies and Their Social and Economic Impact in the Aegean Neolithic. The stage is yours.
Thank you, Barbara. And do I have to be here in front, or how does it work?
The microphone is a big black box in front of you.
Black box. Okay, here. Okay, so thank you very much for inviting me here to this HEAS seminar. And as Barbara said, we're in the beginning of this ERC project From Stone to Home, and we started in September. And we will go on until 5 years' time. And that will be the theme of my talk today. And you can hear me in the back. Is it okay? Yeah. Okay. I hope this works. Well, okay.
Click with the mouse into the picture once.
Into a picture.
One click, yeah.
Yeah.
Now it should work.
Okay. Okay. So what are we going to hear about today? Well, we're going to hear about the project and how we're going to study the archaeological remains of polished stone tools from 7th to the 4th millennium in the Aegean. And then we're going to find out how, can you see this? Yeah, how human awareness of raw material availability and biographies of stone tools is linked to the emergence of different kinds of value and wealth. And then at some point, we will try to uncover fluctuations of inequality in the Aegean Neolithic. That's what we're going to explore in this project. How are we going to do it? Well, we're going to look at some stone biographies by studying them from the sources and then to the final context. We're going to look at some properties of these raw materials, tough versus soft and so on, exotic versus local, symbolic use versus domestic. And we're going to look at the standardization of these objects, or if they are diversified. And these properties and information can tell us something about the value. Is it use or production value we're talking about? Is it exchange value? Is it symbolic value? And is it an economic value at the end? And of course, this is a dynamic terminology of value, but what we're trying to look for is patterns of behavior connected to what kind of value we're talking about. And those behavior can then tell us something about accumulation of wealth. So is it, can look at material wealth, what kind of types do we see in the different contexts? We can look at how the objects were produced, which can tell us something about how skilled people are. Is it novices or is it specialized experts and so on? And we can look about the relational wealth in the different contexts. Where are the different things from? And that we can calculate to some numbers, which we then can talk about or discuss on a more qualified level than previously, fluctuations of inequality and how different new raw material impacts these societies and what they will change in their behavior to get hold of such objects. Yeah. So, can't see that, but already Geosimmel in 1900 in Philosophie des Geldes says that value is a relationship and transactions of objects, which is of course an action, but it's also within the human minds. So how do we get into the human minds? Well, we look at these different kinds of value, and how are we influenced by these terminology of value? Well, there's different theoretical aspects and different theorists who's been working on these subjects. There's of course labor time, which you can calculate through experiments. You can look at commodities and what kind of production sequences we're talking about. Is it more domestic ad hoc or is it more systemized? That's Kopitov's work. And of course, experiments, which goes way back. But in case of polystone tools, I want to highlight Delgado Rack and their work, because they actually looked at the material itself and how tough they are. So they could see a hierarchy of when you're working with these stones. You see that some is soft and useful for some things, while other are hard and they can use for different things. So there is a hierarchy. And when you talk with people who are working with these things, they are searching for stuff which is good X material. That's what they are saying always. But what is a good X material? And can you measure that? It's a feeling they have, but here with pressure experiments on the material and how hard it is to polish and so on, you can actually get some numbers out of it. Okay, so exchange values, of course, there's the cooler rings of the famous work by Malinowski, where in this area they travel, they have to travel. It's part of their symbolic, and they have to exchange these objects. It would be impolite not to exchange them. And of course, the work by Malinowski inspired Marcel Mauss about the gift and the magic behind the gift. So you receive a gift, but you're also obliged to give a return gift. So what is the magic behind the gift? And then, of course, there's the exchange system where you go from balanced reciprocity to unbalanced reciprocity, where you begin, or some begin to speculate in some raw materials where you can get more out of it than you get. So it's a surplus thing coming in here. And that's Saline's thoughts about that. And then, of course, the symbolic value, where some object is said to have an inner power. That's Godilier's work about these objects. And then there's, of course, Weiner's work about inalienable possessions. So some objects are so sacred that you take them out and you keep them. Or sometimes you also destroy them. That's Boas' famous work by potlashes. So you take them out, but when you take things out, it also then results in an increased demand of these things. And then, of course, there's an economic way of thinking that some objects equals different kinds of things in a barter exchange trading network. And ultimately, it's a currency of something which could then equal different kinds of objects. And that's Abertukai, who's been working with that, where things and objects can have an inherent value, which people agree upon. There's a consensus about the value. So we agree today that, a paper note, which is worth nothing in its sense, but we agree it represents a value. And there's a consensus about that. If that consensus is gone, we go back to some other things that we agree upon, and that's gold, or other kinds of material that we agree upon. That's why when people speculate in different money, then always the gold value is what people returns to always. And if it's not gold, it's something else. And there's a key concept here, and that's desirability. What makes it people do all these things? And that's Graeber, who's been working a lot about desirability. I'll go into that later. But that might be the human psychology, because it's probably always been there. There's high prestige resources and there's low prestige resources. And it's all to do with how much time do you spend. So we are back to Karl Marx's original work about labor and labor time. But Graeber also says this quite nicely. He says value is dynamic. It's depending on the context. It's behavioral patterns where structure and agency meet. And for us archaeologists, it's about looking at these patterns to see what's going on and interpret them. And then we might be able to discuss wealth and inequality on a much more qualified level than before. And wealth, that's Boerhoff Mulder, who did a work in et al. In 2009 about wealth and accumulation of wealth on small-scale societies. And they identified 3 types of wealth, as I already talked about: the material wealth, where you accumulate stuff, but you can also look at land, household structures, food, livestock, different kinds of goods and possessions. And then, of course, embodied with the different kinds of skill and the relational wealth also. So these are some of the theories that we've been inspired by, and we will try to implement in our work. Sometimes I've been criticized that these are older theories, but when you look at newer work, I tend to see that it's always old wine on new bottles. That's my opinion. I don't see much, but there's some differences in some of the terminology, but everybody is trying to go back to some of the old theories and see how they match or how they can play up against them. So a lot of it is in my opinion, old wine. Okay, so what are the research objectives here? So in this project, we want to discover new quarrying site. That's empirical, because if you want to understand the relations, you need to understand where did people find these materials. So that's quite important. There's also a risk there that we won't find what we want, but we will get some results from the actual objects, and then we can see that there must be some kind of quarries here and there, but we just haven't found them yet. So we will get a result. Okay, then we're gonna look at the provenance analysis. How do we then argue that these stones are from the source? There we need provenance analysis of these objects. Then we want to combine, of course, technical analysis of the objects and the context. Context is very important, of course. And then from that, we can determine different kinds of value and wealth and fluctuations and so on. So this is the core set of the data set, which will lead us to discuss these concepts of value and wealth. Then we want to develop new models. Can we see new ways of behavior in the economic organization and the economic way of thinking in these societies? And of course, the output is creating an interactive website where everything is out there, open source. So people can also use this and our studies in the future to look for similar patterns. And they can extract the data and use them with their own data. At least that's the ambition that we are working upon. Okay, this is quite a heavy thing, but it's just to show you the analysis flow. So we have the raw data. We're going to look at least 40 sites. We're looking at queries. We're looking at residential units and some axes. We put some numbers in here. It has to be feasible. So we can't put too many and too many. So this is the number we put in, and we're going to look at useware on it. Useware is quite important because it hasn't been done before in a lot of these cases. So that would be something. And of course, provenance analysis. So again, going to look at all these things that I talked with, the sources, the provenance, and the contexts, which will then tell us something about the value. And that flows into the wealth data, which is actually a quantification. Now we're going to look at that. Well, we can look at type counts, of course, of the different types. We can look at the raw material and the sources and exclusivity. So to see when things is exclusive and when it's not. So when it's normal, where you see it everywhere, and when you don't see it everywhere. And then, of course, the function of it by useware analysis. We can look at manufacturing times. How long does it take to find a source, make a boat, sail there, get the stuff, bring it back? All these things you can calculate in hours and labor time. And then, of course, the skill and the level of skill that are involved, and how long does it take to learn these skills? Then there's, of course, depositions and the numbers of them and the types. And of course, spatial patterns, distributions. Where do we see it? Which can then relate to the relational value. Then we can look at something like other kinds of material related to the polystone tools. We can look at, for instance, the faunal material to calculate the meat. We can look at residential units and sizes, and generally in distances and routes to see how things are distributed. And that will tell us something about different kinds of wealth. That will then tell us something about numbers. We can crack the numbers into different statistical programs, spatial network analysis, PCA plots, Gini coefficients, Lorentz curves, and R statistics. So it's all about putting it down to a number. It's very processualist, actually. Okay, and then an open access website and publications and so on. That's the output. So we'll have some novelty in this. It will be explorative in finding new queries and matching it to stone tools. It will be holistic in a new approach because we are interrelating a lot of sites and comparing them with each other. And it is really from stone to home that we're looking at. So it will have an impact on the geological side. We'll have new protocols. We'll look in a new way, we think, we hope, on these matter of value and wealth, and discuss inequality. So we have 4 work packages. So we're starting with the geosurvey because getting to know the queries is quite important. So that will make a baseline of data that we can compare with when we're actually looking at the different archaeological material. So we're in the process of the database design and permits. Then we're doing provenance analysis and baseline on the geosurvey material that we've found so far. And then we'll do 4 study seasons on the different sites. And then we have these analysis, relational analysis at the end. So here's our team, and it's an interdisciplinary project where we have, of course, archaeology and geology and all the relational investigations. And then we have a lot of advisors and partners and different institutions and network that we work within. What are we trying to do? Well, it's a big puzzle. We are trying to puzzle these things together. What's rare? And that can tell us about the provenance, about the network, the toughness of the material. We can test to see the durability. We can see at the use and useware to see how things are maintained. We can look at colors and polishing and the recognizability of these objects. And then, of course, the context, the social practices, and at the end, human behavior, which is the patterns that we are looking for. So what happens during the Neolithic here in the Aegean? Well, what we see is a progression towards an economic way of thinking. And so we're dealing with an area of from the early Neolithic to the final Neolithic in this area, so 6,800 to 3,300. And we know that there is a way of economic thinking, a progression towards that, because in this area around 3000, you have weight economy coming in during the early Bronze Age. So there must be a fluctuation towards this. Why do you get weight economy? Well, you get weight economy to translate different transactions of objects. And when there's so many objects in transactions, it becomes difficult to have a consensus of the value of it. People might have a different opinion. And in order to solve that problem, then you introduce weight systems. And then, of course, you have later coinage and so on. So this is a progression, and we're interested to looking at that progression in Neolithic times. Polystone tools, well, they start with the early Neolithic in the Levant, and then it spreads to Western Anatolia and the Aegean in the 7th millennia. And this is the area that we are looking at. The polystone tools from the Aegean, well, they're characterized by axes and adzes and chisels. And not much has been done with these objects. Why the Aegean? Well, there's a hole there. We see some of the early studies was by Sundas in 1908. And that actually led to the study of different sites individually. Nobody really looked at polystone tools interrelated with different sites. So this is the tradition that followed. Every time you have a huge excavation of a site, you have somebody taking care of the pottery, somebody of the lithics, and somebody at the polystone tools sometimes, not always. And it's sometimes back in the appendix and nobody really care about it. And so it's kind of difficult. And that's what Perlet summed up. She said it in her book from 2001 about the early Neolithic. Nobody's done anything about it. There's a huge potential here. Somebody do it. That's basically what she said. And she's been working close with Anastrulia, and she had the same frustration. I'm publishing stuff from different sites, but I don't have a huge project that can collect it and compare it over a huge area. So there's a lack of interrelation studies and also raw material studies, because this has a huge potential, because we can see that they're using different raw materials and they put a lot of effort into them, because it's all high quality. Nothing is of low quality. Everything is really carefully selected. So it has a huge potential in understanding some networks that we haven't been aware of. So there's this whole lack or gap of knowledge. There's also no typology here. I mean, we don't have a typology. It's all functional. It's all dynamic. But that's because nobody studied it in an over-regional level. there is some tendency when copper comes in, we can see that the cross section of the axis, or the stone axis, becomes rectangular. So clearly they're imitating copper. So that's one thing that we can see. But the rest, we don't know. We don't have a clue about this. Now to the Neolithic sites. So in Western Anatolia, until recently, there wasn't a lot of sites excavated, actually. But since last 40 years, there's been a huge amount of site actually excavated. And one of the most famous one is Chukwurejoya, which Barbara directed. And they show a lot of potential in, especially the polystone tools, but also in a lot of other things. But this is quite interesting. In the Aegean, there wasn't a lot of site either. And a lot of them not really well published. If you look at the last overview by Kundru in 24, she has some of these published polystone assemblages from these sites. It's not all of them, but it's the one that she could find in the literature. And you can see that there's one area which stands out. Of course, there's Sicily. There's a lot of old sites which needs to be looked at. But this area is quite interesting in the northern part of Greece because they've been building a lot of roads, motor highways and so on. And in that connection, they've been excavating a lot of new sites with the newest methods and with the highest standards. And so there's a lot of potential of looking at sites in this area which has high documentation. So this is quite interesting. So of course there's more Neolithic site than this map shows, but rarely no info on polystone tools. And here you could see just a picture of such polystone tools, and you can see that there's many raw materials just on this picture. So people really cared about this. And this was one of the pilot studies that we made to get this grant here, was to look at different stray find assemblages just to see what is the potential. And then, of course, we also looked at some sites like Chukwurejoya and others, and we could see that this has some potential here. And why is that? That's because the Aegean in general, the raw material is quite densely concentrated to distinct areas. And I give you an example here from Higgins and Broadbank, where you can see the early copper sources and the obsidian sources and emery sources. There's also very fine sources of different kinds of marble of different quality. So the sources are concentrated quite densely in quite distinct areas. And that's very important when you're doing the provenance analysis. And of course, you probably all know the success that Renfrew and others started with obsidian sources, where they then could separate the different sources by using, then now portable XRF. They used some other methods back then, where you can actually also separate the different sources, especially on Milos, which tells you something about alliances and how people are in connection with each other, depending on which source they use. So, and there we can do that. But the problem here again is that nobody really systemized that in the whole picture. It also takes a long time, of course. But one researchers that did that was, of course, Milic. Both the Milic here, but also the other Milic, and also Reingruber did a lot of work there, where I tried to summarize what they published, and where you can see different kinds of network emerging, where you see that the Aegean is mainly focused on the sources from Melos, but at the edge of these, you see also things coming in from the Carpathian, and on the west coast of Anatolia, you also see some of the sources coming in from Anatolian sources further inland. So it tells you something about the networks. And I think that if you do that with the polystone tools, you get different kinds of network on a local level, regional level, and large scale level. It's also a story about routinization of routes. So when people are organizing a trip, like the Kula Rings, you have to have an organization. You have to have institutions doing these things, individuals doing these things, or communities doing these things, as kind of specialization to gather such boats and sail around, depending on where you're from. But when people are saying, yes, they went sailing for obsidian, no, they didn't. They went sailing for a lot of things, not only obsidian, but marble in Naxos, maybe, different kinds of other raw materials in different islands, in different raw materials. And our job is to try to figure out where those sources are, because then we can start reconstructing these travels. And we know they traveled and sailed around because they went to Milos, and it's quite obvious. But they went on many stopovers, especially in this area here of the Cyclades. And we have evidence of boat and boat technology from Andros, from Strophilas, published by Televantu. This is then dated to 4,500 to 3,300. But here you see them. They are there, all the kits and so on. And they're actually quite advanced for final Neolithic. That means that it goes way back in time, these ships. We don't have a lot of dugout canoes because the preservations for wood in this area is quite bad. But we have from Italy such canoes going back to 5,500. And in South Scandinavia, we have something which is even earlier. That's from the Mecklenburg culture. That's 8,000, 9,000 BC. So of course they had the potential of sailing around. And we know this because obsidian was also exploited in the late Paleolithic times. We also know that in some islands and Crete, we found Achillean. And I mean, they have to sail there to get there. So of course, people were sailing around. So what we are interested in is trying to figure out different kinds of raw materials and how these networks relate to one another. And here, the empirical thing is to find these queries for the polystone tools, which can reveal these new networks. And just to say that it can be a lot of things that you can look at obsidian, you can look at cinnabar, you can look at metal, you can look at different kinds of these raw materials. And that's what we did in our pilot study. We looked at different kinds of raw material that we could see in these assemblages in our pilot studies for this grant here to see what is the variability of the things that we see. So we have the metamorphic rocks with jadeite and nephrite and so on, all the way down. These are the ones that we observe. And it's high quality, all of them. And these represent things that people have been looking for. And they spend a lot of time looking for these, apparently, because some of them are rarer than others. And then, of course, there's the volcanic ones with the hematite and dolerite and so on. There's a lot of them. And then, of course, there's the sedentary with bauxite and also merskrum. I mean, what do they use that for? I mean, this is a soft material, but we've seen it in Citagre. They use it, but for what function? One has to question that. It's not a very hard material. It's just to say that there's a huge variability here. And we did some pilot studies of some of them based on the different assemblies we've seen. And here there's hematite, and we could see in the hematite different kinds of hematite, different types. So they must present different sources. That could be local, regional, or large scale. But that's what we have to look for. And the more we look into relations, we can start looking at comparing the things and seeing if there's something that looks alike. And here you can see the distribution of the hematite. So the stars is actually where we know from literature that there should be hematite. And there we have some of the axes. And it's a matter of linking these things together. That is one of the future tasks in this project, at least some of them. it's a huge, this is huge. This is difficult. It's not that easy. But we see some things that are similar. And here's an example. They're quite distinct. And they have, we think it's a metabauxite, and they have these patterns there. And actually one of the clubs was found in Çukurova in the Bronze Age layers. So this is quite interesting. And we think that there might be a source there in the Menderes Massif. And we also think that sources is normal, and you see that often in this Aegean region, but they're very rare, extremely rare, because many times there's been modern quarrying there and they destroy everything. So you want to find this area where there's a refugia landscape where nobody's done anything. That's where you can find these things. And hopefully we'll be able to do that. So if we don't look in this way, we don't have the overview, and then we don't know what we're looking for. So we need these kind of studies to look for these things. And hopefully we'll find them. The same goes for nephrite. This is actually a rare material. So hematite is quite normal. That you will find in almost every assemblage. It could be 10%, sometimes 20%, but mostly it's diabase and gabbro and so on, which is normal. But nephrite is quite rare. That could be 5%, sometimes 10%, but quite rare. And you see the quality of it is very different. So there's the pure nephrite, which you see here, which is actually from Çukurova. Yeah, so this is quite early, where you see these small things, but also some of them could be large. And then when you're talking about nephrite, there's also a matter of distinguishing the material itself. It's a geological discussion, mostly about tremolite and actinolite. It's very different things they tell us archaeologists. But the sources is unknown. So we don't know where they are. So that would be one of the tasks to find, if we can find it. That would be one of the tasks in this project. And here you see the distribution of nephrite. And the stars marks some of the possible sources that we want to look for in the future. And we know that there has to be several sources exploited, but we just don't know where. We think that there might be chances in the border between Bulgaria and Greece. There might be something there, but we don't know. We have to have a look. What does it tell us? Well, it's different procurement patterns that we are talking about with different distances. So there's traveling, there's organization, there's social meeting network, there's narratives embedded in these objects and places. So it's pieces, places, and objects. And that gives you a rare awareness of raw material and how much effort they put into finding the best raw material, and the rarity of the raw material, the labor time they use, and of course the desirability. What do they want to do to get it? And there you could look at, rivers, beaches, or high up in the mountains. We see all examples. What is interesting here is the concept of desirability, because desirability has some things that we can discuss on a theoretical level. What makes desirability trigger in humans? What do they think when they think about desire of getting an object? Well, it's the properties, the qualities that they compare with each other, and then make a hierarchy of the different material. Then there's, of course, the exclusivity. How rare is it? And the rarity can tell you something about how well connected you are. And then there's, of course, the appealing to the senses, which can influence behavior and fashion and so on. And then, of course, embedded things and stories and narratives in the object biography, which connects us to places and stories and tells you something about the network that people are related to, just as the Kula rings. Then there's, of course, fungibility or currency, system of exchange. So if people have a consensus that this is a currency, then they know what it's worth, and then it also creates a desirability because it can systemize the transfer and the exchange. So these are some of the things that drives desirability. So there's a lot of human psychology in it, of course. So we're investigating patterns of behavior and social interactions and social practices. We are investigating labor time and the specialization of these productions or standardization, and of course the exchange of the contact and the network that they have. Key for this success is identifying the sources, looking at the scale of these productions, and of course dated, looking at the different contexts from where it was produced until the final end of the object. So from stone to home. And of course, looking at the desirability, what will people do? Would they change the behavior in order to get these objects that are of certain desire? Can we see these changes? So I can tell you that in Denmark, the hunter-gatherers get Schulleiskeilen of metabauxite from the Jestebsko source. And what do they do to get these things? They change their behavior because they start hunting more fur animal and more animal of antler, and not only antler, but calves, which has soft skin. So that's nice for walking. So these hunter-gatherers is becoming part of a system, but they change their behavior in order to get these foreign exotic access, because they then start doing these specialized hunting places. So they're becoming part of an economic system. And the question is, can we see this in this material? That's what we're searching for. Change of behavior and things coming in, which is exotic and possibly desirable. So we've done a case study here about the jadeite as a pilot study in qualifying this project in the Aegean. And that tells us something about new sources where we had some success. The reason why jadeite is obvious for such a case study is because it's quite rare. So we can actually test the whole thing, just as the obsidian. It's only a very few places that we find it, and that could tell us something about behavior. And so I'll talk a little bit now about this case study. So a little bit about jadeite terminology. It's a rare source. It's more rare than gold. And there's, of course, a geological terminology here with different kind of things that it is chemically. Then there's, of course, it's very hard. It's very tough. It's ideal for making axes. It's almost unbreakable. It's because the crystals are interlocked. So it's made under huge pressure, but low temperature. And it has created, when you polish it, beautiful colors. So it's very aesthetic, beautiful. It's like an art object when people see it. And they use it in different kinds of Neolithic communities in Europe and Asia and Caribbean. And we can see that it's when these communities become aware of this material, they start traveling for it, and they start to explode the network alliances and trade networks of the jadeite, which goes beyond the regional sphere. Remember, the obsidian was within a regional area of the Aegean, but here we can see that the jadeite goes beyond that. And that's what we see both in Europe, in Asia, and the Caribbean. It's the same behavioral pattern, and that's because it's so rare and it's desirable. That's what we think anyway. That's our hypothesis. Of course, there's been a huge focus on especially jade and jadeite by Pierre Pétrin and Anne-Marie Pétrin. They did a very important study about an anthropological research about ecology of a tool, where they went to Indonesia and some of these islands and investigated how they procure different kinds of material. In this case, it's mostly serpentinite. where they exchange them, and they're used for gift alliances and through a big men system and so on. But what was important was that just the procurement was part of a whole symbolic ritual praxis, and so he thought, well, we haven't really known where the jadeite is found in Western Europe. Maybe they went up to the mountains like they did in Indonesia. And so he went up to the mountains, and what did he find? He found the sources of the jadeite. So there's a human behavior there again that goes through history, the way that people do things. And so it's a fantastic research that they did. And here you can see that they have different kinds of quarrying and the way they do things, and how they polish things and how they exchange things and how they're used as bride prices and as currency. So you have the whole value thing, but mainly Petrarca and his team is arguing that the jade and the jadeite material is a holy material. This is the explanation. So Baudelaire's interpretation, so to say. The funny thing is that it's mostly Sörensen that he saw, and he was invited to study. But when they looked at different axes that he was presented at the end of their visit at some point, he got an axe and he noticed, oh, there's something odd with this. It's a little bit heavier and so on. And that turned out to be jadeite. And they said to him, every time you come to this community, you just take this axe with you, and we know you're one of us, even in 100 years' time. So there's a lot of relational value in such an axe. But the funny thing is, they didn't want to tell him where the sources were. That was only for the very, very secret people, not for him. Okay, so he looked at these things in Western Europe, and it's a huge network with the sources in Begua and Viso high up in the mountains, and then a huge network. And they also went to Bulgaria and saw jadeite axes there. Pierre then wondered, okay, there is a source in the Aegean on the Cycladic island of Syros. And he said, and he thought to himself, okay, I have to be sure that the axis that we measured with our methods is not from Syros, because I published it as they were coming from the Italian Alps. So I have to exclude, or at least find out, is this from Syros? And that's why he wanted to go to Syros. Syros is a very known geological place for metamorphic rocks. This is the type locality for blue cysts, for instance. So it's very known. People go there all the time. So he went there in 2014. Here you see the Syros, where it is. And this is the place where he identified a lot of boulders, where everybody identified a lot of boulders. Yeah, and here you see it's in the northern part. And it's a known geological place. So he went to collect geological samples there in 2014. And this was actually the first time that an archaeologist visited with the eyes of archaeology this place. So there's been a lot of geologists walking around there. But when he walked there, he noticed that around some of the boulders, there were flakes lying here and there. There was also pottery of prehistoric origin, probably. So this has got to be a site. And so he collected a lot of these geological samples, and you could see that it was probably a small scale production there. But I mean, he was only there for a week or something. So, I mean, this is a huge area. So of course it's difficult to see this. In the meantime, I was working with my postdoc in Copenhagen, and we have a huge collection of axes from all over the Aegean. And I noticed from my previous work on jadeite axes on the Neolithicization in Denmark that some of these axes from this Aegean collection, that's got to be jadeite. And I was like, what the heck, where's that from? And then I contacted Pierre and said, I found these jadeite axes, and I think this is from the Aegean. Could that also be from the Italian Alps? Could it be from cirrus? And he said, well, yeah, let's see. I mean, this is interesting. And then we made some analysis of them in France, and we concluded that some might be from cirrus, some might be from Italian Alps, some from sources that we don't know. And that was the reason why we went there from 2016 and then onwards, where we also collected more material to see the variability of this source. And we spent more time there. And we could see that geologists is destroying these sites. These are actually archaeological sites, but they're destroying it by napping stuff on some of the boulders. And you can see the fresh napping here, but next to it is a napping that's actually weathered. So when they're doing this, they're destroying it. Maybe not intentionally, but this is a problem for us. But of course, we are looking at stuff that has heavy weathering on it. Then we know that it's quite old. It's also a challenge to look at the differences between the Italian Alps data type and the cirrus one. This is quite difficult. But one area that we might be able to see is how detailed the structure of the data type is in Italian is more fine-grained in the Italian Alps and a little bit more coarse-grained in cirrus. Sometimes we also have some things that are more fine-grained in cirrus as the Italian Alps, but the grain size is quite important here, just by looking at it petrographically. We did these spectral analysis, or that's what Pierre did, on both the material that I had in the museum collection in Copenhagen, but also comparing it with the jadeite access from Bulgaria. And you can see that it's almost pure jadeite. It doesn't have any other mineralogical composition. That's why it's so, it's almost the same that he's measuring. It's because it's almost pure jadeite. And when you then look at the samples from cirrus, you see that there are more impurities in it, more dips and so on in the spectral. And that's because there's more on other minerals in it, albite, glaucophane, feldspar, and so on. And that's why you have different profiles. And that's why he concluded that these jadeite from Bulgaria must be from the Italian Alps. Yeah. Okay. We wanted to go back to cirrus because we identified that some of these axes in the Copenhagen collection and also in Tuguretti might come from cirrus. So we wanted to go back to see, can we date these quarrying activities here, even though they're small? Can we see how large scale production it is? And who are exploiting these sources? And why did people begin to search for such jadeite sources in the first place? I'll try to answer the when and how, who and why we are in the process of trying to answer. But when and how, we know now. So here you see the geological samples from the Campos Valley, where you see them in the fresh, and when you see them polished. And there's a world of difference. When you polish them, they become beautiful objects. It's just beautiful to look at. It has an aesthetic value, so to say. It's nice for the eyes. Okay, we did, of course, some X-ray diffraction analysis to see the mineralogical composition of the geological samples from the Campos Valley, and we could see that that's a very different quality. Some has high content of jadeite, some has lower content of jadeite, but then again higher content of amphicite. So the quality is varied, and that's because we are not looking at this material through the eyes of what's the best X material. And the best X material is when there's a high quality of jadeite or amphicite in it. And here you see some of the measurements we actually did on some flakes, which is prehistoric. And there you see all of it is high quality of amphicite and jadeite. So they were very aware of the high quality of this raw material. And we actually also did some analysis of the axes. And here you again see high quality for most of them of amphicite and jadeite. So they were very aware of this what is X material? And when we are walking around now, we're always saying to ourselves, what's X material and what's not? And what's X material is what we take. Of course, the best thing is to find what prehistoric people already nabbed, because we know, we can see that's high quality, all of it. They've been very, very distinct and very selective about what they chose, even here in the campus world. And here you see the area where we identified 6 activity zones, where there's dense concentrations of jadeite boulders, where we see denser concentrations of flakes and preforms, mostly made of jadeite, but also some amphicetite and also eclogite. We see especially one area, area 1, where there's site 1, where we see wind erosion exposing a whole napping surface. And you see it here. It's like a Pompeii situation. I mean, there's hammerstones, there's anderson, everything there. But it's Aeolian wind erosion, which just makes it visible for us. Other places, it's more covered by sediment, so we don't see it. We only see fewer pieces. But here, we really see it. And it's in the thousands of things lying here. And there's also another important thing. You see all the different flakes and so on, but there's also seashells there. So people have been bringing, because this is high up in the valley, they've been bringing these seashells up there, Patilia vulgata, this elbow shell, and eating them as a small snack when they were working there many years ago on these jadeite things. And that can be dated, and we did so. And here is the interesting date. You can see that with the reservoir effect of around 400 years, you can discuss if it's more or if it's less, but around 400 years, you get a date from 6,400 or 500 to 6,000 BC. That's early Neolithic. This is the earliest evidence of jadeite production and exploitation in the world that we see here. So this is a quite fantastic news that we have. And it's actually synchronic with the layers of where we saw the jadeite axis in Çukurova. So this actually complement each other really nicely. So we think that somebody from Çukurova and Western Anatolia went to this place because it's synchronic. We definitely have to look at that. And how do we do that? How do we do that? We have to look at the pottery, of course, to see, because we have different kinds of pottery, which we can then compare. The other thing that we could see is that the erosion just eroded the surface. But this is actually a layer which is a meter thick. And you can see that here. It's thicker, these layers. And this is a part of the erosion of this site. And so if you have a meter thick layer, I mean, you have in the hundreds of thousands of objects here, lying here. And now we dated this seashell. And then people might argue, well, couldn't that be something that just came there by accident or whatever? But we also dated the objects themselves, the jadeite itself, by OSL dates, because jadeite contains potassium feldspar, and that's ideal for making OSL dates. And that's directly on these to see when they were exposed for light at the last time. So we did that in these profiles here. And what did we see? It corresponds with the C14 dates to the 7th millennia, these dates. So it fits. This is really early Neolithic stuff that we are seeing here. We could also see, by discussing the scale of this exploitation, some of the boulders, especially near this first site, you could see that there are fragmentation of it, like lying down there. And that's because it's been heat treated. So they had a heat treatment there, and then things fall apart. Why do they do that? It's because it's easier to nap and get smaller pieces out when you do this heat treatment there. That's what they did. And we see that that's such a heat treatment that exposing the surface of the boulder for so much heat that when it falls down, to these sandy layers here, then it's so hot that it created an oxidation of the sand, turning it red. And we can date this as well. And we did so, and it also says 7th millennia. So we know everything is synchronic here. And that tells you something about the scale of the production here. We sort of show the different dates, everything pointing towards the 7th millennia. The challenge is, of course, OSL, it has wider insecurities than of course the C14 dates, but it is within the framework of 7 millennia. Now to the scale. So we collected everything on the surface on just these 30 square meters. I mean, this is a huge area, and this is just one of the area, but we selected that because that was where we could see the dense, just to see how much it is. And we collected over 17,000 objects just on the surface. When we returned there 2 years later, there was just a small lying there, but exposed by erosion, and it was just lying there. And it's meter thick layers. So what we have to calculate is how much is it, but it's in the hundreds, in the millions of objects lying here. So this is not a small scale production. This is a huge scale production. The problem is how many axes did they produce when you have such a preform and you start napping away. How much do you produce then? Is it like 1,000 flakes to produce one object? Then we can start calculating how much could they have produced here. You can also look at it in how much do they weigh. We also weighed them. And so we think that this is quite a large production here, especially when they are meter thick, these layers. So this is not small scale, this is large scale. But of course, we need to calculate and do more experiments to see how much does this produce. But I can tell you that this area, I mean, nothing can really grow there. You see that? Nothing can really grow there. That's because it's so dense. It's almost one big block of stone or flake. And there's all the sand is intermixed with powder of jadeite because they were picking stuff there, clearly. So it's just lying there. And so this is a huge scale. And of course, we find the whole charade of preliminary reduction flakes, thinning flakes, secondary thinning flakes, trimming flakes, the whole blades used as preforms and the actual preforms there. You see them where they've been picking. We also see, of course, pieces of obsidian within this these two workshops, and we see pottery of different types and different tempering. Of course, we're interested in seeing, okay, does that relate then to other places and compare that? This is a refugia landscape that we're looking at. And we think that at this time in the Atlantic period, it was open oak forest. So it doesn't look the way it looks today. And so they have access to wood and so on. It's not a desert, kind of a desert landscape as it is today. At that time, it was more densely forest. And that means that if you came here every 10 or 20 years, you need markings to figure out where to go in the landscape. And these markings are still there as cup marks in the landscape. We see them. If you go in from the beach and you follow along the water river system and up to the jail, we see these markings all the way through. So we are following in the footstep of this refugia landscape. And here you see one of the places which is marked with two larger boulders of eclogite. And this is a place where you turn up to side one. And this is marked with these heavy cup marks here, but also at the end here, you see a preform of a large jadeite preform, which is quite large, which they put there on purpose so that they sort of marked where to go up. And these markers we find all the way up. Markers of jadeite put in position on the routes where you go up. And we, at the first, when we looked at this landscape, we didn't see it. We were only looking at the soil. But the more we looked at it, we could see, okay, this is actually markers lying here and there. It's a totally refugia landscape. that we didn't realize before quite late in the thing. But when we then first found it, we just saw it everywhere. And we also see depositions in fissures, like cracks and so on, where they put preforms or hammerstones and so on in these fissures. It's often of jadeite, and it's in boulders lying around the jadeite boulders, and they're often made of eclogite or blue schist and so on. And that's because we think that this is like a symbolic practice, and these people must have known that what surrounds the jadeite is actually blue schist and eclogite, because they're made under not so high pressure, and the highest pressure is in the center. That's where the jadeite is. So if you are thinking in those terms, you would think, okay, I took something away here, but I need to put something back to secure that it's there, like putting a seed in the ground. That might be one of the interpretations. We also see in the jadeite fissures that they put obsidian in them. And here you see one of the things that you see just obsidian tipping up there. And we know that that's got to be Neolithic because it's quite wide, the blade that we found. So they put stuff in there, maybe for the next stopover, which is Millers or what I know. But it's definitely a symbolic behavior. And it could be interesting to go back to Millers to see what did they put into the fissures of obsidian there. Nobody looked for this. Okay, and we can see that this practice of putting stuff into fissures is, we see that all over this valley here. We mark them there with red and with white squares. And these depositions, we think is, of course, a symbolic behavior. That's why it's so important to look at these cramming sites, because there we really see what narrative is put into the material itself, and how that is embedded in the objects that they produce later on. And these stories of these faraway places is embedded into the material, thus giving it at least a symbolic wealth. That's what we can see with these behavior here. We know that cirrus axis is found in different places. So Chukwueze is one of them, but we also see them in Dimini, we see them in Urlu, and we see them as far away as Egypt. So this is actually covering the whole Eastern Mediterranean area. Remember, obsidian was only within the regional area, but what breaks it is the jadeite. That means that there must have been a consensus about the value of this material, which people agreed upon and which went on and on in exchange systems far away. And one of the things could be these narratives that we see already when they're exploiting it at the source. So, of course, provenance analysis is important, and we're using ICP analysis to map the different geological composition of the jadeite. And we do it by using a SEM, where we then get a whole surface of what's exactly jadeite, what's anthracite, what's eclogite, what's what. And there you can then measure directly on the mineral composition and the chemical composition of the different things, different minerals. And the other thing that's very important is that we can find other minerals like zircon, which we can date. Of course, it's a metamorphic rock, so it has something from the host rock, but also when it was made for the pressure. So, but we can date it, and we can compare those dates and those chemical composition with the different sources that we have from the Italian Alps, we have from Cirrus, and we have from other places like the Caribbean and so on. And there, then we get a picture of the provenance analysis. And we have to do that. And that's the first step. And the second step, of course, to combine the same geological samples with non-destructive analysis. This, of course, gives a challenge in the quality of the data of the provenance analysis. But here we figure out a combination of using FTRR together with portable XRF gives the best results according to Michael Brandl. We also tried Raman spectroscopy, which we thought at first might be a good idea, but we realized that that's not a good idea. It's the quality of the data is not that good. But FTIR and portable XRF gives a good result. What about the distribution of the geotide axis? Well, here we have the distribution combined with Pierre's distribution of the Italian source of geotide, where you see the ones in Bulgaria and the ones in the Aegean, where we think some of them might be cirrus, some might be unknown, so there might be different sources. And you can see the geotide sources that we put in cirrus, of course, but there's also a new player of source, which is more fine-grained geotide, and that's in Bursa region of the source called Hamanchik. And there we also identified light greenish geotide, which is just as fine-grained, if not even more fine-grained than the Italian Alp geotide. So this might be one that we have to check to see if the Bulgarian axis and a lot of the things in Western Anatolia, and for that matter in Greece, could also be exploited from the Hamanchik. And of course, we have to do also survey there to see what's the scale of the production there and what are the dates there. So there's a new player in town, and that's that Hamanchik. And that's of course also part of this project. So we want to look for different kinds of geological sources. That's one of the main things, especially nephrite and geotide, because they are exotic materials where we really can see the different network and the stretch of the network. That's our main focus. But when we look at the different sites, we visit these sites or nearby, we can also look at the local material that is found in these areas. That's why we have so many geologists in the project. So somebody's going to look at the axis, but somebody else also going to look at the areas where the sites are actually there to see what's local and what's regional and what's large scale. So here are some of the sites that we're looking at. So we'll start with the geosurvey and then the field surveys in different regions. And here are some of the sites and the dates, which range from 6,800 to the final Neolithic. And here you see the sites that we want to study in the different field work season. So we already started with a geosurvey on Syros, which will continue until 28. That's where our permit is to. Then we'll do a geosurvey in May in Bulgaria and Anatolia for the sources of nephrite and the Hamanchik and maybe other unknown sources of geotide in that area. Then we have a first study season in October in northern Greece. Then we have the Hamanchik in 25, also in May, and also trying to apply for permit to do an archaeological survey there, maybe in 26. That's our aim anyway. And then we have a study season in southern Greece in 26, and then another one in Western Anatolia in 27, and then a fourth season again in the Thessaly area in 28. So we were very busy, and there's going to be a lot of traveling to this area here to figure out things. And I want to thank you for the attention, and without the help of all the, I mean, this is a team effort, of course. I'm not the only one, but and all the institutions that help us, also with the pilot and so on. I mean, the work when Barbara invited me to look at Chugoriti, that was one of the first steps. I mean, and look where we are now. We are on the edge of a breakthrough here, as far as I see it. And we already seen a lot so to qualify why we should do this, I think. So thank you very much.